I find it difficult to talk to older generations just because either I'm written off as a dumb kid or I am just completely attacked for my point of view because it's different than theirs.
I think it's okay for our generations to see things differently.
At the end of the day, we can all disagree on what the issues are, but we need to have that mutual respect and kindness for each other to agree to disagree.
I think this is important because we have to know how to work together as a society. When we can't work together, things break down.
Ultimately, we're all Americans, we're all humans. We all have to come together, and in doing so, we have to understand that there might be differences, and those differences are usually to be celebrated.
I think that just being open to listening is the most important thing, and realizing that everyone's opinion is different and it's valid.
Ultimately, all of these issues that we're seeing, regardless of whether you're a millennial or not, Jesus is calling on us to, reach across the aisle, reach out of our comfort zone and get out of our bubble. I think we all just need to be kind to each other and really do a better job of listening and finding common ground.
I think that just relationships with people are what are gonna change this world. Having open conversations and having conversations where you're willing to listen to the other person.
You can either learn by living or you can learn by listening.
Listen.
Listen.
Listen. Listen.
Listening.
Listen.
Listen.
We kick off a sermon series today around listening. We're going to listen in this series to the voices of our younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, and we're listening to them not because they are the future, but because they are the present. Millennials and Gen Z, they are the two largest generations in America today, and we're going to listen to this group as they ask questions about the really big issues, the things that they're concerned about in our world today. We're going to listen, and then we're going to together ask the question, what would Jesus say about these concerns? And each week we're going to discuss how we can, across generations, work together to address these big, critical issues. Several months ago, I received a text from Tom about this message that I'm going to give right now. And good luck, says Tom. Lord have mercy upon Mark. It's encouraging, isn't it? I'm a little nervous about starting this series today, but I'm mostly excited. I love and I live to bring people together and to gently challenge them to follow Christ, maybe for the first time or maybe more faithfully. I believe that God has given me a unique skill for listening, and I'm living into my calling and my purpose today by addressing the divisions that are present in our country. I want to invite you to listen with me for what God might say to you through this message today. We're basing this series off content from Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, the largest United Methodist church in the United States. When they introduced the promo for this series, someone in their congregation leaned over to his wife and was overheard saying, well, we're not going to be here to listen to any of that nonsense. Whoa. I mentioned that story because if you think that listening to the voices of millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, and you don't care to hear those voices, well, if you're in business, you're going to be out of business in 30 years. If you think listening to the voices of millennials and Gen Z is nonsense, well, you're going to have a terrible relationship with your kids and with your grandchildren. If you think listening to these voices is nonsense and you care about the church, your church, or this one or another church, then it has no future if you're not listening to the voices of millennials and Gen Z. So in this series, we're going to listen. We're going to listen together. A Church of the Resurrection surveyed over 500 millennials and Gen Zs by giving them a list of the topics that regularly show up as top concerns for those generations. They asked which of these are most urgent to you. And the top 4 that these generations chose are the 4 topics that we're going to address in this series. And we're doing our own survey as well across all generations here at Sycamore Creek, and you'll see the link on the screen. If you haven't taken that survey, I encourage you to do so. We're using our survey to look at generational differences. And in light of the survey results, each week we're going to ask the question, what would Jesus say about these things? We'll ask, what can we do then in response to what Jesus says? Now here's the thing, different generations have been shaped by different experiences. So I'm going to begin today by highlighting differences between generations. And So when we talk about generations, we know what I'm talking about. There are huge differences between different generations today. The graph that you'll see on the screen was produced in 2019 by the Pew Research Center. So note that's 2019, it was 2 years ago. So add 2 years to each of the ages listed on the screen. And on the left side of this graph is the greatest generation. Now, these are people who are born before 1928, and some of these folks are still alive. That includes my 96-year-old grandfather, who's part of this generation. We live for the first time in history with 6 generations alive at the same time. Now, there have occasionally been some individuals from 6 generations, but today we have a large populace of 6 different generations. The next generation you'll see on the screen is the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945. The things that shaped this generation are the Great Depression and World War II. Those two life experiences as children growing up during the Depression, and some of them who came of age and went off to fight at the end of World War II, where they lost parents or siblings in the war. Those two things had a profound impact on their lives, and generally this generation, they're very frugal and they're very responsible. Now we come to 1946 through 1964, and the next generation was when 2 million GIs came back from the war and they started having babies. This generation is the baby boom generation, the boomers, right? Ages 57 to 75. And this generation, the boomers, they experienced huge major cultural shifts. Elvis and rock and roll were part of that culture shift. The Cold War was huge for this generation. And well, they grew up in fear of an atomic bomb with exercises in school to hide under their desks in case of a bombing, as if that would help. This generation experienced a major shifts and concerns for civil rights for everyone. Starting in the 1950s, the civil rights movement became something that shaped this generation, and well, that continued with Dr. King and into the 1960s. This generation was the invention of the birth control pill, which fundamentally shaped how women and families planned for having children, but it was also part of mobilizing women into the workplace. Suddenly, there were kids raised in homes with both mom and dad who were out of the home working. And that gives rise to the next generation, my generation, the Gen Xers, Generation X, born from 1965 to 1980. I was born at the very end of this generation in 1978, so I'm special. I'm a baby Gen Xer. This generation is also known as the latchkey kids because their mom and dads were often both at work. This generation was impacted by the boomer generation deciding, you know what, we're not going to stay in a marriage if we're not happy anymore. And there's a huge rise in divorces that impacted Gen X kids growing up. For Gen X kids, their parents were likely either divorced or they were both working, hence latchkey kids. This is the first generation to really get their hands on computers, and there were lots of things that were happening for this generation, like the Sony Walkman and the rise of video games. This generation was originally known as slackers, you remember that term? But it ends up, they're really hard workers. They care about a work-life balance because they watch their parents work like crazy to get ahead, and this generation recognized that they paid the price for that at times. And that brings us to the generations that we want to focus on today, the millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, and those born after 1997, Generation Z. Let's take a look at those generations. The generation that grew up with these in their homes, they are millennials. There were computers in everyone's house. That's a Macintosh from 1984, and computers shaped this generation. But so did this pivotal event in 2001. They watched the towers fall in their classrooms in school. They watched the aftermath and the reality of terrorist attacks settled in. This generation has experienced a level of connection to the world through the internet that has never been seen before. They had the capacity to have relationships with different people around the globe who spoke different languages and had different cultures. It's a mind-blowing thing that I don't think we still fully understand. Now, one of the Gen Xers gave this generation the gift of Facebook, which is part of the creation of social media. Again, I think social media is something we don't really fully understand or comprehend the impact that social media has on how we do life and how we think and how we get our news and how we have relationships. These are the millennials, and then after them we have the Gen Zs, born after 1997. And there are some very unique things about this generation, Gen Z. Now, let me show you this on the left side of the screen. You'll see that there's a graph, and 18% of boomers were from a racial or ethnic minority. 30% of Gen Xers, 39% of millennials, and now 48% of Gen Z are from a racial or ethnic minority. This, of course, is unprecedented in American history. When Europeans first came to the United States, they were the minority, but since that time, with the founding of the United States, most people in the United States have been white. And our culture has been dominated by people who are both white and what they like and prefer. For Gen Z, their friends, their family members, likely their spouses, they're going to be people of color. This generation experiences the world differently. In addition to that, if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see that post-millennials or Gen Z will be the most educated of any generation in history. More Gen Z than any generation before them are going to go to college. These are the people who are going to be your doctors and your lawyers and school teachers and pastors. And they're going to be the people that you turn to for advice. In the US today, 40% of Americans work for somebody who's younger than themselves. If you're still working, well, the odds are you're going to be working for someone who's younger than you. Now, Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with a president who looked like this. 2 generations before, people were fighting to not give up their seat on a bus. And then in 2008, President Obama became the first person of color to be president of the United States. This generation is the first to grow up with devices that they can touch with touch screens. And my kids are Gen Z. And well, if my parents have trouble with their iPad or their phone, they have my kids fix it or explain it for them. My kids are digital natives. They're immersed in technology. This generation doesn't send letters. They don't even send email. This is old school. They text, right? They don't even text with words or sentences, but with emojis. Gen Z is breaking the mold in many ways, and along with the millennials, they're deeply concerned about social justice and inclusion. Inclusion is a huge deal for millennials and Gen Z. We'll discuss that more later in this series. Now, these generations haven't grown up ducking under desks because they're afraid of an atom bomb. They've learned to duck under their desks because there might be a threat of an active shooter in their school. So here's a chat question for you as you think about generations. What generation are you a part of? And what things do you think have shaped you and your generation? Let's discuss that. So I spent a lot of time just now on these generations to give you a reminder that millennials and Gen Z generations, they're not the future, they're the present, they're the right now. They are the 2 largest generations alive today, and they're going to shape our world. And they have questions, they have concerns, and we're going to listen to understand, listen. Now, one of the top concerns for millennials and Gen Z is a concern over the polarization in our country. In nearly every survey of Gen Z and millennials, this topic rises to the top. They're deeply concerned about how divided we are as a nation. So let's dive into that. In 2018, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, that's CIRCLE, at Tufts University, they did a survey of 18 to 24-year-olds, and they found that 82% of young adults said they were concerned about the values of the American people. Now pay attention to this. In the generations past, the older generation was concerned about the values of the younger generation. Today, young adults are concerned about the values of the older generations. And that's significant to understanding generational differences. When it came to the concerns they had about those values, one of the most important values to young people was how we treat each other and the polarization in our country. 57% of young people in this survey said they were losing faith in American democracy. We feel this in Washington. We feel this in conversations with our families together for holidays. We feel this on social media. We feel it here in Lansing. A Church of the Resurrection asked young adults, what experiences do you have with political polarization? And this is what they said.
Most older generations have such strong opinions that I am nervous to talk to them about my beliefs and my opinions. I've kind of been told by my parents to not bring it up around older generations just because I'm supposed to respect the people older than me, and I can get heated about my topics that I am passionate about.
When you look at Congress, for example, and you see a bunch of baby boomers in power leading the country down a path that many would agree is polarizing.
In my family, we have very different political opinions and views. Some of the older generations in our family have some, whereas my sister and I, who are both millennials, have very different ones. We find it very difficult in our family to have those conversations without it growing into something that's negative. and that creates arguments or hurt feelings. I would love to see that begin to change and us to address that and address how to have good conversations and healthy conversations.
And so it's frustrating to view the political system just because we're stuck.
We are stuck. We are stuck. I think we can all agree on that, right? Next week, we'll talk about mental health, and there have been numerous studies that have shown that young people are among the most anxious and stressed out generations since they started tracking these things. Now, why are they stressed out and anxious? Well, part of this, I think, is the environment in our country where there's constant conflict. The Pew Research Center has been doing polling since 1994 on Republicans and Democrats to see how close together they really are or how far apart they actually are. Listen to what they wrote following the election of Joe Biden as president. Americans have rarely been as polarized as they are today. As polarized as they are today. And they continue. A month before the election, roughly 8 in 10 registered voters in both camps said their differences with the other side were about core American values. And roughly 9 in 10, again in both camps, worried that a victory by the other would lead to lasting harm to the United States. That's polarization. And what the Pew Research Center has found is that among Democrats and among Republicans, they've moved farther away from each other over the past 20 years. I don't think this is surprising data to any of us. We feel this. We experience it. I recently heard about Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist at New York University, and he has talked about polarization. He said that there are a number of major serious issues, different problems that we are facing as a nation and as a world. He says they're all solvable problems if we would only talk with each other. And he concludes we have to learn to listen. This polarization has been going on for years. It's not new, but it seems to be getting worse. Well, why is that? Multiple researchers have found that we tend to live with and interact with people who see the world the same way that we see it. We often value sameness. So most of the people we interact with think the same way we do. And if they don't, well, they're often quiet because it's uncomfortable to buck the crowd. We do this, right, with churches. We find a church where everyone agrees and we see the world similarly, and we do this with our news sources. We know that there are different news sources and we know what they stand for and they represent, and we tend to look for news that confirms our own feelings or thoughts. It's called a confirmation bias. Most of us, we don't do research. We don't see if our bias is correct. We find someone who will confirm what we already think and feel. And we do this even more now with social media. 59% of millennials and Gen Zs, they use social media as their primary news source. Now, social media is brilliant at providing news because it will parrot back to you exactly what you feel and think. And here's another challenge with social media. We now live in tweets and memes that get passed around and forwarded from person to person. And let me ask you this tough question. Do you think any complex ethical or moral or political issue can be easily reduced to a tweet or a meme? Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use memes or tweets or have an opinion. We should, but it's one thing to believe something that's right, and it's another thing to poke someone in the eye on social media. I'm going to irritate you. I'm going to poke you. And what happens is we go back and forth with memes and tweets and reposts that move us further and further away from each other and more into our respective camps. So sometimes a tweet or a repost of someone on Facebook, it's not actually the best way to influence someone else. I don't know if you thought about that. We don't listen well to differing memes or tweets. Now, it's not all bad, so here's a question for discussion. What are the strengths and weaknesses of social media for political discussion? Let's discuss. Now, social media does have strengths and weaknesses. Now, one of the weaknesses is that it can cause division, as I've said. All of these things are working together to move us further and further apart. And what happens now is we find it hard to even be with people who see things differently than us. Let me repeat that. We find it hard now to even be with people who see things differently than us. And that's a problem. You see, at its core, we have a loving people problem. And That's a challenge for us to live out our faith, because that's one of the big ones. It's one of the guiding principles of following Jesus, right? It's to love our neighbor as ourself. And well, I hope to push you a little bit today on that. And every time I do that, every time I push you, I have to be careful, and so do you. I have to ask myself, is my job to make myself feel better by poking you in the eye, or is it to actually influence you? And if I'm going to influence you, then I better ask, what's the best way to do that? You see, we are deeply divided politically here in the United States, and we saw that play out again and again in different ways through the election last year, and then leading up to the inauguration in January. As a pastor of Sycamore Creek, I'm a pastor to people who are strong Republicans and supporters of former President Trump. I'm a pastor to people who are in the middle. I'm a pastor to people who are strong Democrats and supporters of current President Joe Biden. Throw in a pandemic. It's been a fun year to be a pastor, let me tell you. And I really am 42, by the way. In the midst of political divisions, I have opinions myself. I have strong opinions. And I recognize that many of you have strong opinions. And I've asked myself a lot lately, what is the approach that Jesus took to the things that were going on in his day? You see, you can look through the Gospels for the times that Jesus preached against a political leader, specifically Herod Antipas or Pontius Pilate or Emperor Tiberius. And do you know how many you'll find? None. Jesus mentioned Herod Antipas once, and he called him that fox, which is probably a negative thing, but that's it. And as a reminder, these people were crucifying Jews. They were doing terrible things. And what Jesus did instead, though, is he called people to live out a faith in which God is their king. He gave illustrations saying, like, the kingdom of God is like this. And he said, this is what you should be doing. Things like care for the marginalized, care for the hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and imprisoned, care for the immigrant or stranger among you, love your enemy and love your neighbor. Go and be salt and light to the world around you. Jesus talked about these things, but he didn't directly address Tiberius or Pontius Pilate or Herod Antipas. This is what Jesus did. Jesus called people to live differently in their world. We need to find commonality in obeying Jesus and living differently. Surely we can agree that keeping kids in cages is not right. Surely we can agree that race, the race that you were born with, shouldn't dictate your economic outlook in life. Surely we can agree that bullying speech has no place in our schools. Surely we can agree that war and assassination and weapons are not something to be taken lightly. Surely we can agree on lots of core values. Let's start there with commonality and work together to live differently in our world. Now, you didn't come to worship today to hear a talk on politics, and I'm not going to give you one. But I think if I were to sit down today with you and talk politics, I would tell you that there are certain things that our politicians get right, and there are certain things they get wrong. And our world has become so polarized, especially around our former president, Donald Trump, that I say that there are certain policies of his that I agree with and fit with following Jesus, I'm going to get in big trouble with the Democrats. And if I say there are certain policies that he got wrong and that don't reflect the Gospels and following Jesus, I'm going to get in trouble with most Republicans. And we have become so divided that it's incredibly difficult to be president. One side thinks you can do no wrong. The other side thinks you can do no right. And that brings me back to influence and influencing someone. I ask myself all the time, how do you actually influence people? This is a key question. And I have found that when you start attacking people, when you start calling them names, well, very seldom do they listen to anything that you say after that. If you can't find anything good, or if you can't treat that person as a human being, it's going to be really hard to have a conversation that changes anything. So here's another question. How do we talk about our divisions in a way that might lead to change? I'm going to give you some thoughts on that. As Christians, we look to the scriptures and we see what they have to teach us, and then we live that out. And I'll tell you, I want you to have passionate political beliefs. I want you to stand strong for things like fighting injustice and being concerned for the poor and the sanctity of life and a whole host of other things that come at us right out of the Bible. But how do we sit down and talk about those things in a way that might lead to change? Well, the thing is, if we look at the New Testament, every single one of the books in the New Testament was written with the backdrop of conflict. In the Gospels, well, you can find conflict underlying all the stories about Jesus. You can find conflict in the book of Acts and in all the letters of the New Testament. And there's conflict everywhere. So the writers of the New Testament are constantly addressing conflict all the time. In 1 Corinthians 13, there's a well-known passage where Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, which was deeply divided and broken. And Paul wrote to this church and he said, if I speak in tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all the mysteries and everything else, and if I have such complete faith that I can move mountains but I don't have love, I'm nothing. I hope it's clear here to you that love here in this letter is not a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's a dogged determination to treat another person as a human being. It's about another person loving them, caring for them through action. Paul continues, if I give away everything that I have and I hand over my own body to feel good about what I've done, but I don't have love, I receive no benefit whatsoever. Then Paul describes what love is for us, and maybe this is how we should treat each other. Maybe this is how we should march for causes that we believe in. Maybe this is how we should use social media. Love is patient. Love is kind. It isn't jealous. It doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. It isn't rude. It doesn't seek its own advantage. It isn't irritable. It doesn't keep a record of complaints. It isn't happy with injustice, but is happy with the truth. Love puts up with all things, trusts in all things, hopes for all things, endures all things. Paul concludes that this kind of love, it never fails. We have to be people who care deeply about what's going on in our world. We're going to talk about some of these things over the next few weeks, but we have to do that in a way that might actually bring about change, or we just push people further and further away. Jesus talked about love in the midst of division this way in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, you have heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who harass you, so that you will be acting as children of your Father who is in heaven. Whew. That's a high standard, isn't it? Are you living that out? That's how we practice love when it comes to political division. That's how we love the person with the opposite view from us. The more obnoxious they are, the more I'm going to work to love them. And it may be that practice of loving them, that it changes them, and in the process, it changes me too. As James writes, loving in the midst of disagreement, it looks like lots of listening and being slow to speak and slow to get angry. I don't think we do enough of that, especially online. This loving people we disagree with stuff is really hard, especially when they think or say things that hurt us. I want to wrestle with this a little bit. So here's another question for discussion. What are your top tips for having loving conversations across political divisions? Let's discuss that. Here's the thing. We can love people well, and we can march and speak out for causes we believe in. But we can't love people well and march and say hateful things about other people while we're marching. That undermines everything we're marching for. We can love people well and we can be on social media, but it's going to require slowing down and being careful with our posts. We can be passionate and we can point out that things that there are people need to know that can't be right. And we can still love. We can still love the people who we're speaking to, even those who disagree with us. I want to share with you a final story about how that's done from the movie The Two Popes. I don't know, have you seen that movie, The Two Popes? It's pretty marvelous. And in the movie is Pope Benedict, who wants to retire as Pope. No one has done that in like 700 years. And he wants to retire, but he doesn't want the wrong guy to be Pope after him. So he's going to keep going if the wrong guy is going to be Pope. And the wrong guy is Cardinal Bergoglio, who's in Latin America, who will ultimately become Pope Francis. Now, Pope Benedict was worried Cardinal Bergoglio was going to become Pope because he totally disagreed with him. Cardinal Bergoglio, well, he also didn't agree with Pope Benedict, and he also wants to retire. He's tired of being a cardinal, but he has to have the Pope's permission to retire, so he flies to Rome to meet with the Pope, and they start talking. Pope Benedict says, I don't agree with anything that you say. I disagree with you on everything, your positions, everything. But they end up spending 2 days together. And at the end of 2 days together, listening to each other, hearing each other's stories, something changes. Pope Benedict decides that maybe it would be a good thing for the church for Cardinal Bergoglio to become Pope. Watch this scene from the movie.
Your style and your methods are entirely different to mine. I don't agree with most of the things you say, think, or do, but for some strange reason, now I can see a necessity for Bergoglio.
So that's a fictionalized account of what happened, and well, I have no clue, let's be honest, if that scene really happened in real life, but I love the picture of it. Pope Benedict, who is very conservative on lots of things, looks at Cardinal Bergoglio and essentially says, I see your heart. I see who you are. I've listened to you. And maybe the church needs what you have. And that's what happened in the end. Cardinal Bergoglio became Pope Francis. Now, Cardinal Bergoglio chose his name as Pope in honor of St. Francis of Assisi. There's a prayer of St. Francis, probably not actually written by this St. Francis, but it became popular in World War I and then even more popular in World War II. 2 wars where millions of people lost their lives. In closing, I'm going to invite you to pray this prayer with me together. You'll see the words on the screen. Let's pray. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Amen.